I'm Em Sauter, better known as Pints and Panels.
And I'm Don Tess, better known as the Don of Beer.
Welcome to episode 58 of the All About Beer podcast. Every 2 weeks, we talk with leading experts and take a deep dive into one topic in beer. This week on the show, we're going to be talking with the Pete Brown about IPA history and myth. Visit allaboutbeer.com and follow us on social media at allaboutbeer. And please visit our Patreon page if you're feeling generous. Patreon.com/allaboutbeer to support this show and others. So, Don.
Yes.
Do you have a favorite IPA myth?
Well, favorite is maybe not the right word.
Okay, sure.
but yeah, I've mentioned on this podcast before that I think people take the idea of IPA needing to be fresh a little bit too far. I mean,
yes,
the stuff lasted the sea voyage from England to India. So can we calm down about your 2-week-old IPA being past its prime?
I find that if IPA is too fresh, it's
Exactly.
too green, and a lot of people really like that hop burn.
Oh my
Which
God, really?
yes, a lot of people really like it. Which just in New England, especially where I live, I think it just shows that there's so many ways that IPA can be interpreted, and I'm really
Yes.
excited to talk with Pete about all of this. It's going to be a really good conversation.
This is going to be awesome.
Yeah. But first, if you would like to help support the All About Beer podcast, reach out to podcast@allaboutbeer.com. Speaking of supporting the show, here's a word from our sponsors.
Looking to explore a new city with a vibrant beer scene? Put Rochester, New York at the top of your list. Located in the Finger Lakes region along Lake Ontario, Rochester is a top beer destination, home to over 24 breweries, including New York State's oldest, Genesee Brewing. Enjoy everything from hazy IPAs to crisp lagers, award-winning breweries, beer festivals, and tasting events all year long. There's always something fresh on tap in Rochester. Start planning your trip today at visitrochester.com.
We've participated at FOBAB since the very beginning of our brewery, which was 2012.
John Barley, Solomouth Brewing, 4-time FOBAB medalist.
This event gives brewers from across the world a chance to come here and compete with one-of-a-kind beers, some of the best offerings from breweries. These are beers that the brewers themselves are most excited about. If you're serious about beer, this is an event that you should not miss. For a full list of brewers and tickets, check out FOBAB.com, FOBAB.com. We'll see you at FOBAB November 22nd and 23rd in Chicago.
Welcome to Estrella Galicia, where brewing excellence has been a family tradition since 1906. They're all about lager, rooted in German brewing heritage. Maintaining their commitment to tradition, they brew exclusively in their original brewery in La Coruña, Spain. Each beer boasts its own distinctive recipe. No shortcuts, no compromises. They shun high-gravity tricks and avoid additives, even in their alcohol-free beers, and stick firmly to traditional methods. Their passion for beer sets them apart as they embrace and celebrate the art of brewing. At Estrella Galicia, they love beer above all things. Experience the difference and know more about it on Instagram at Estrella Galicia, USA.
Pete Brown is a British author, journalist, broadcaster, and consultant specializing in food and drink. Across 12 books, his broad, fresh approach takes in social history, cultural commentary, travel writing, personal discovery, and natural history. And his words are always delivered with the warmth and wit you'd expect from a great night down at the pub. He writes for newspapers and magazines around the world, and he is a regular contributor to radio and podcast. He was named British Beer Writer of the Year in 2009, 2012, 2016, and 2021. He has won 3 Fortnum Mason Food and Drink Awards, has been shortlisted twice for the Andre Simon Awards, and in 2020 was named an industry legend at the Imbibe Hospitality Awards. He was recently accused of being the 31st most important person in the drinks industry, and he lives in Norwich with his wife, and London with his wife Liz and his dog Mildred.
I don't feel we're worthy to talk to him.
I know, my gosh, this is going to be very excited. Welcome to the show, Pete.
It's nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course, of course. First off, I just want to say thank you for coming on the show. The IPA is a lot. It's an extra. And so like whatever that means. And so I'm very thankful for you to come on and dispel. So there, I have a list of myths we have a list of myths rather that is like exceedingly long. I don't want to get to all of them. But secondly, I guess the big question is why? Why are there so many IPA myths? Is it because it's a popular style? Is it ignorance? Is it people just having fun because people like a good story? Why do you think that?
I think it's because it's an incredible story to start with.
Mm,
The idea that this beer was brewed and taken to India on these huge romantic toll ships, it lends itself to romance, and it's an incredible story about beer. And so stories like that are simplified over time. They're retold. They're turned into little sound bites, and people get things wrong. And it's also a story that's over 200 years old now. And over that time, details get invented. There are bits of the story which you think are absolutely core, and then you realize that something got invented 70 years ago and there was no response, there was no kind of record of it before then. And then we now have a new generation of beer historians who like to disprove myths, and sometimes the disproving of myths creates new myths as well. And I think it's
mm.
just kind of an endless process.
That's true, because you wrote an article that was now 2009, which feels like, oh my God, that feels like 200 years ago.
That was 200 years
That
ago.
was
Yeah.
200 years ago.
Holy crap. You wrote an article about IPA myths for All About Beer magazine. Shout out to our group. And I'd love to go down the list actually with you so we can talk about them. Because I feel like some of them may have changed since you wrote them. I don't know.
I think so. I think so. There's
Yeah.
been a lot more research done.
So I guess
Thanks to you, Pete. I just want
yes, Pete, and many fine historians, smart people. I guess the big question I have is who invented the IPA and where does the name come from?
Yes, it was never invented.
Yes, yes,
Like most,
thank you.
and we love a good origin story in beer. And IPA's origin story is quite dull actually, and takes place over the period of about a century. So IPA, India Pale Ale, was going to India for at least 60 years before it got the name India Pale Ale. And it was a beer that was it evolved from October beers, which were strong beers that were brewed and laid down for the winter and drunk in country houses in Britain. And it started being sent to India because people felt that a robust beer was needed for the 6 month sea voyage. That's not always true, but that's what people felt. And then the people who were drinking it in India would often make fortunes off the back of colonial pillaging of the
What?
country. And,
I've never heard of this.
Wait,
What?
colonialism is bad?
yeah,
Okay.
it's become a lot badder since I wrote the book. I was accused of fake colonial guilt when I wrote about this. But I think it's become a much bigger part of the story now. But what that meant at the time was that people who were working in India, British people who were working in India, could become rich beyond their wildest imaginings in about 3 years. And it was a pretty dangerous place to live. So after 3 years, you'd come home, and British people would bring there's a lot of stuff that at the same time as they were exploiting the country, there's a lot about the country they genuinely loved. And they wanted reminders. So the first curry restaurant opened in London in 1829, I think. People brought back gingham, which was originally an Indian fabric, a lot of Indian food, a lot of Indian customs, habits. And so they wanted the beer that they drank while they were over there. And so India Pale Ale comes into advertising copy in about 1832. And you can now enjoy the beer that you had in India. It's called India Pale Ale because it's reminiscent of those beers you had over there.
Well, that's amazing.
I love how it's a like a I'm all I can think of right now is the Australian like love in the 80s here in America where like it's the kind of this I don't know that's sorry
Yeah.
that's from The Simpsons but like there's like yeah that's wonderful.
But like you're mentioning curry and this and using the word India Pale Ale, this was popular with more than just people who had been to India, because presumably that's a relatively small part of the population.
It was small, but they were very as I said, when they got back to the UK, they were very rich, and so they became quite influential.
I see.
And yes, it did catch on, and what we had from about the 1830s, 1840s onwards was beer would be shipped mainly from Burton-on-Trent to London, and then some of it was going on the ships to India, and a lot of it was being stored for up to a year in warehouses in London to replicate the aging effect that the journey had on the beer. So at this point, India Pale Ale is being sold in the UK without having gone to India.
Okay. So everybody who has read a book about beer knows who George Hodgson is. But what
Yeah.
say you? Is he really that important in this story of IPA?
He is, because of some fairly sharp business practice that he did. His beer was popular, and shipping to India was a difficult process. The ship's captains had some leeway about what they took. And when you read, there was a publication called the Calcutta Gazette that started in 1785, and the ship's captains would arrive in India, and they would have fine china, they'd have mahogany furniture, any of the comforts of home that people in India needed. And they took beer with them. And Hodgson offered favourable terms and kind of cornered the market. So it was Hodgson's beer that was going to India. The first edition of the Calcutta Gazette advertises Hodgson's Pale Ale. And once he'd cornered the market, he started to change his terms and started to kind of charge more for the beer, charge the sea captains a lot more for taking it. And the thing about that was, at the time, this was the East India Company. This was a private corporation, which was the world's first multinational corporation. It had its own army and its own navy. It's probably not a good idea to fuck with a private corporation with its own army and its own navy.
Fair.
And so the head of the East India Company basically went to Allsop's Brewery in Burton-on-Trent and said, we don't like Hodgson, what he's doing. Could you recreate his beer? And apparently that was the start of Burton-on-Trent IPA. And what they didn't know at the time was the water in Burton was much more suitable for IPA than the water in London. And suddenly Hodgson's beers didn't seem quite so good anymore. And so Allsops and then Bass took the market from him.
Oh, I've never heard of a corporation trying to use its monopoly power for evil.
Yeah, I know, right? I always think of corporations as fair and just. Shocking.
It's strange. And the big tragedy in India is that this corporation had tax raising powers.
Oh my!
But also by legal obligation, a private corporation is legally obliged to maximize shareholder profit. If it doesn't do that, you're going to go to prison. So you have tax raising powers, and you have to by law maximize revenue for your shareholders. So that's how the British created a famine in which 10 million people died.
Mm.
And here's Tom with the weather.
Yeah. Is the East India Company the only people? Are they kind of like the FedEx, UPS of the UK, or are there other people going to India, or are they like them? Or they have the monopoly?
Yeah, they dominated everything. It's really curious because it was the world's first multinational corporation. It did own India, and that in turn was basically what kickstarted the British Empire. And yet they've been written out of British history almost exclusively. There's very, very little mention of them. I do think, quite rightly, that we're probably a little bit ashamed of them. And I really didn't know very much about them at all until I was researching my book about India Pale Ale and India.
Are they shipping other beers besides pale ale to?
Yes. Yeah. So
that's a big one.
That brings us back to the myths. It turns out, again, looking at the Calcutta Gazette, they were advertising cider, they were advertising small beer, they were advertising porter, they were advertising brown ale. So all these beers were going to India, and they were getting there in drinkable condition. And this has led to, there was a myth that India Pale Ale was the only beer that could survive the journey. That is a myth. That is not true. But then we have the counter myth, which is that actually India Pale Ale wasn't really that big in India at all, because people were drinking more porter than they were India Pale Ale, that kind of thing. Some of that is true, but the thing is, India Pale Ale captured the imagination over there like no other beer. I've seen letters from people. They would write detailed criticisms of the beer back to the brewers and say, I think you need a bit more hop in it. And this is very nice, but you need to kind of...
there was Untapped in India? That's amazing.
Absolutely. Nothing's new under the sun, Dan.
That's amazing. This IPA tastes like it's 7 months old, not 6 months old. 3
Exactly.
stars.
All of that. All of that.
So who was drinking the IPA over there? I mean, obviously there's the Brits, but I mean, were locals, soldiers, like who
The
was
locals never got to drink it.
Oh,
I
wow.
haven't actually established this yet, but the reason I'm an authority on this is that in 2007 I decided to have a traditional 19th century India Pale Ale brewed, and I took a barrel of it to India by sea,
Oh my
on the
God.
traditional sea route,
I think I
for the
might
first
As
recall
one
time.
that.
as one does.
As one does. It's almost cost me my marriage. It almost cost me my sanity. It's a good read, though. But I recreated that sea journey, and I went to India, and did as much research as I could. And what I felt at the time was that a lot of what we do in beer research, quite obviously, is linked to brewery records. So there are historians out there who can tell you the exact amount of hops that went into a beer, the exact recipe, the exact ABV, and so on. What I did was research a lot of diaries of people who lived in India, and got mentions of how the beer went down when it was over there. It was adored by the civilian population. There's a lot of hang-ups about, oh, it was drunk by the officers in the army, and the work and the enlisted men drank porter. They didn't drink IPA. They drank a lot of porter. They also drank a lot of IPA. It's a bit, pretty much all the Brits over there drank it. But the most powerful thing when I took my barrel to India, at that time, Indians had never heard of India Pale Ale. And so I was able to present it to them for the first time and go, this is your beer. Beforehand, they only ever got to it, their ancestors only ever served it to British people at the dinner table.
What?
And now, of course, there are several breweries in India now brewing India Pale Ales in India. So it's nice to see that change.
Yeah, that's so awesome.
So when you made your beer, this is another, I don't know if this is a myth or not, well, we can talk about it, is the conditioning. How did you jam the barrel full of hops? And then what about the wild yeast, and like how long did it take? And was it in sparkling condition when it showed up and everyone thought it was amazing? Like how did
Yeah.
that's what a lot of people, tell you, and you're like, is that true?
Yeah. I mean, the conditioning on the journey was a very real thing, and that's what I wanted to explore, because way back, 200 years ago in 2004, 2005, most IPAs had pictures of tall ships on them, and every back label would say, "This is the beer that went on the 6-month sea journey and matured and became this sparkling, wonderful beer." And every time I would read a tasting note like that, I would say, "Yeah, but it hasn't, has it? Because you haven't taken it on the ship to India, so you don't know." So that was my decision to try and sort that out. And to cut a long story short, basically what happens is the kind of aging that would happen in a year in a cellar happens in about 6 months at sea. So we opened my beer, and it had all the kind of vibrant hop aromas. They're the first things to go. They disappear. Well, what you get instead is somewhere between a kind of double IPA and a barley wine. Much more complex, many more layers to it. And when I opened my beer and made those tasting notes in Calcutta in December 2007, another beer writer, Melissa Cole, opened a barrel of the same beer, the same batch, in London, and it was still very green. It was still spiky with hops. And so my beer had significantly changed on the journey compared to her beer at home. And then when we tried to taste it a year later, it tasted more like my beer in India had tasted the year before.
Is it the temperature swings? Is it the rocking? Is it all of the above?
It's all of the above, and as I've reflected on this, of course, there's some things that I missed. So you've got the constant rocking. So the beer is aging; it's slightly staling, but it's constant. It's in constant motion. So that process is kind of happening throughout the barrel. It's a temperature change. One of my favourite myths, which was dispelled when I was in the middle of the Atlantic on a sailing ship, is they'd say, "Oh, the beer was stored at the bottom of the ship because that was the coolest part of the ship." This is utter nonsense. When you're near the equator, the ambient water temperature is about 30 degrees, and the cabins are under the water level, under the water line. So you're surrounded by 30-degree water, and the air is slowly baking. So I think a kind of very slow, subtle sort of pasteurization thing went on as well. with the beer. But also the records show that a lot of beer, when it went to India, was actually strapped onto the deck because it was too warm to put it in the hold. So you got and that temperature fluctuation. So it's about 14 degrees when it leaves the UK. It's about 35 degrees at the equator. Then it's down to about 15 again when you're going around the Cape of Good Hope. Then it slowly rises again. So that temperature fluctuation is constant and steady and slow. And then there's a simple time. There's a 6 months aging. And then the element that I didn't have is the aging that comes from it being in wood. So I, by necessity, had a aluminium container. So I missed the microorganisms. I missed I believe now I've kind of gone backwards and forwards on this, but I believe now that there was a sour element to the beer, really understated, but there, and a dry element as well. People compared it a lot to champagne at the time.
Like brewed
So
IPA.
I didn't quite have that.
Yeah, brewed.
Yeah, yes, there you go.
I do want to just interject, and for our American listeners, 30
Oh,
C is about 86 Fahrenheit.
That's right.
I was just going to say that. So what about like, so you say the dryness is there and the slight tartness, is that from, that's from like Brettanomyces and whatnot? Because I know is there any myths about the Brettanomyces, or is that accurate?
I think, like I say, on reflection, I think it's probably true. But of course, all the records of IPA going to India, this was before Pasteur. It was before microbiology. It was before we knew what Brett was. That wasn't discovered until the early 20th century. So we can only conjecture by looking at the tasting notes that people give us, and the tasting notes that I've seen suggest that there was some Brett present. But we're really speculating.
Just a little bit of trivia. Brettanomyces means British yeast.
It does indeed.
Would they have reused the barrels, and that's where the wild yeast is coming from? Like, I'm imagining shipping full barrels there and then shipping empty barrels back isn't necessarily the most economic. Although, would they have sometimes actually shipped IPA back so it has like a 1 year conditioning and it tastes like even more amazing in England?
No, that's another one of the myths that's in the beer article. A lot of people say it was shipped there and back. It simply would not have been economic to do that. Also, remember, we were plundering the country. So the ships that came back were laden with silks and precious cargo, or a lot of them actually went on to China and then came back full of tea from China. There was this kind of triangular trade going on. So the beer didn't come back, but the barrels would be reused. They'd be broken down back into staves, and they'd be shipped as components and then reassembled when they got back to the UK.
Right. Okay.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
This is an awesome conversation. We're going to take a short break and we'll be right back with more IPA myths with Pete Brown.
Looking to explore a new city with a vibrant beer scene? Put Rochester, New York at the top of your list. Located in the Finger Lakes region along Lake Ontario, Rochester is a top beer destination, home to over 24 breweries, including New York State's oldest, Genesee Brewing. Enjoy everything from hazy IPAs to crisp lagers, award-winning breweries, beer festivals, and tasting events all year long. There's always something fresh on tap in Rochester. Start planning your trip today at visitrochester.com.
We've participated at FOBAB since the very beginning of our brewery, which was 2012.
John Barley, Solomouth Brewing, 4-time FOBAB medalist.
This event gives brewers from across the world a chance to come here and compete with one-of-a-kind beers, some of the best offerings from breweries. These are beers that the brewers themselves are most excited about. If you're serious about beer, this is an event that you should not miss. For a full list of brewers and tickets, check out fobab.com, FOBAB.com. We'll see you at FOBAB November 22nd and 23rd in Chicago.
For all the beer lovers out there, Estrella Galicia offers an immersive experience dedicated to the world of beer in its museum, Mega, Mundo Estrella Galicia, right in the heart of its brewery in La Coruña, Spain. So what makes Mega stand out? It's the only beer museum in Europe located within a functioning brewery and offers visitors a personalized experience. As you explore, you can interact with different elements and access information that matches your own interests. Whether you're a history buff, a brewing geek, or just curious about the process, Mega tailors the experience to you. One of the coolest aspects of Mega is its origin story. The museum was conceived to encapsulate the old brew house, which was operational from 1972 to 2012. So while you're walking through Mega, you're not just in a museum, you're stepping into a piece of brewing history. Learn more about it on Instagram at Mundo Estrella Galicia.
And we are back. I want to ask you, had mentioned this in our email chain. I want to talk about haze.
Yes.
And you said that there's a myth that like IPAs were always hazy. Will you
I mean,
tell me more.
Yeah, this is another new. I mean, this is a very recent one. Only in the last 5 years or so. But I'm in my mid-50s now, and I'm becoming very conscious that there's a whole generation of craft beer drinkers and craft beer brewers who were children when I did this, which is a really scary thought. And as far as they're concerned, craft beer started in 2010. When millennials kind of got into it, and IPA has always been hazy because IPA has been around since about 2010, and it's a hazy craft beer. And I actually got into quite a heated argument with a very good brewer of hazy pale ales and IPAs. Well, when I tried to explain to him that IPAs used to be clear, said, "Okay, I accept that you used to drink clear beer, but that was not IPA because IPA is hazy. That's the definition of the style." And it's like, okay, whatever. And I've judged Don when we were judging the Canadian Beer Cup a couple of years ago. I had someone on my table who got a West Coast IPA and said, "This is not an IPA. I'm ruling it out because it's not to style." And we had to explain that, yes. We had to explain that no, not all IPAs are New England IPAs and hazy IPAs. But the tasting notes from India are very clear, and so was the beer. They talk about it being bright, they talk about it being sparkling, they talk about it being effervescent, and it's obvious that the beer was clear back in the day.
Yeah, but I can't believe we have to even say that, but okay. I think in modern, speaking of modern IPA, we think of American IPA and British IPA, mostly defined by the hops being used. British IPA being, Fuggles and Golding, for example.
Yeah.
But you say that Burton IPAs actually used American hops. Can you tell us about that?
They did, and I found out a little bit more about this actually since I wrote the piece and since I wrote the book. IPA was so big around the 1870s that we simply weren't growing enough hops in Britain to hop the beer, and it was a very heavily hopped beer, as we know, and so we had to start using beer from the United States. So using hops from the United States. And there are records in the Bass archives that talk about the unpleasant flavors of black currant leaf in these nasty foreign hops. And a few years ago, I was in the Guinness archive and I just picked up a book from the shelf and I opened it at random. And this was written in 1964, and it just said, American hops have these really nasty, unpleasant, fruity and citrus aromas and flavor characteristics. So we just use them for bittering hops, so that they don't get in the way of the majestic Fuggles and Goldings. So yes, we did use American hops, but as a build on what I've written before, I think we only use them as bittering hops.
What about the rise of lager switching? Did that kill the traditional IPA? Is that why, when you go into a pub, like a regular normal pub in the UK, it's got the Carling and whatnot,
Carling
and those are
Black
the black
Canadian
label.
brand,
Yeah.
It's funny. Proud Canadian brand, exactly. That's funny. That's when I first started writing about beer in the early 2000s. This was one of the questions that obsessed me. Because yes, as you say, lager is now 85% of total British beer. But it wasn't until about the 1970s that we started drinking lager. We started drinking lager a lot later than the rest of the world. But going back to my old stalwart Calcutta Gazette, in the 1780s, you have these tiny little sort of classified ads for the ship's captain who was brought in his latest kind of batch of IPA. by the 1900s, the Calcutta Gazette has full page ads for Beck's lager and other German lagers. So lager did take over, but there was more happening to it than that. In the golden age of IPA, getting madly drunk every single night of the week was a badge of honor. It was about status. You were no one if you weren't throwing up by 10 p.m.
Delicious.
And then 100 years later, India was almost a Christian fundamentalist country, British India. It was frowned upon to do anything like drinking. There were things like soldiers would raise money for a new hospital or a school, and the hospital or school would refuse the money because they knew that the soldiers drank beer and they didn't want to be associated with that. So it got really weird and extremist. So among people who were drinking beer, lager did kill IPA, but there was so little beer being drunk. It was mainly tea that people were drinking by that point rather than anything alcoholic.
I have a follow-up about lager in the 70s. I once got a Facebook comment from a guy that said that lager was introduced to pubs in the 70s to get women to go to pubs.
It was originally.
And I was like, that's crazy. And I was like, what
Yes.
And then I realized that I was like, you know what? Maybe he's right.
Yeah, they had all these ads from the 60s for brands like Carling with a blonde for a blonde and other such enlightened catchphrases.
Oh.
But then that didn't work. It didn't get lager brewers the volumes that they were after. I know. And then they started advertising it to men, and men went, no, lager's a drink for women. And they're like, where did you get that idea from?
You.
We've only spent 10 million pounds a year for the last few years telling this for women. No, we didn't. No. Forget all that. We've never said that. And so I'm just about old enough to remember that lager had quite an effeminate image in the 70s when and then they had to spend even more millions to persuade us that it wasn't feminine.
Kind of like a great taste, less filling light beer here in America in the 70s. Because it was a diet beer.
Yes.
And they marketed it to women. And then now,
Yeah.
and then you got John Madden and other sports stars being like, no, great.
No.
Yeah, anyway.
Yeah.
So yeah, I can't believe that because I read that comment and I was like, no, that is total, like that's a crazy myth. And the fact that he was right
Yeah.
is wild. Okay.
And in
You're
the
gonna have
end,
to go
lager
back.
finally,
Go ahead, Pete.
sorry, in the end, lager finally broke through because it was the drink of a younger generation, the kind of post 1968
Oh.
rebellious
Not your- yeah.
generation.
Not your dad's beer.
One,
It's
not your dad's beer. That's how it finally broke through.
I see. I was just going to say to Em that she needs to go back to her Facebook and
I should have
Apologize.
I clipped it and I sent it and was like, look at this crazy bullshit. And he was right. Most of the and I'm all right. I'm so sorry, sir. Like you were correct.
Pete, today we kind of think of pale ales as being a fairly tightly defined style. You were kind of describing the flavor of your experimental pale ale as being kind of double-ish. Like, how do you think of today's modern imperial IPAs, double IPAs, all the various, like there's 100 different IPA styles now. How do you think they compare to an original IPA, a historic IPA?
If they do
Yeah,
at
If
all.
they do at all.
It's really tough to say. I've done it's quite a hard event to do, but I've done a tutored tasting before where I present 6 completely different beers and say at one point in history, each of these beers was considered the quintessential IPA. It's a style that constantly changes. IPA, going back to our hazy conversation, IPA now is the opposite of what IPA was back in the day.
Yeah.
So it was used. The whole point of it was it's a beer that aged well, and now we're told that we have to drink it within 3 weeks. It was a beer that was about that didn't have a huge hop character by the time it was drunk. Now it's all about the hop character. It used to be a beer that was assertively bitter. Now there's no bitterness at all. So does that mean one of them is not an IPA? No, it's just that IPA changes what it is all the time. In England, we have one of the biggest beer brands is Green King IPA. And everyone gets so angry because they're a big corporation. It's not a real IPA. It's 3.6%. It doesn't have a big hop character. But if you go back to 1928, when it was first brewed, that was the character of IPA. If any brewer from 1928 had been asked to describe an IPA, they would have described something like Green King IPA, which again, in many ways, is the opposite of what we would consider IPA to be. So every now and again, you get someone who says, it wasn't this color, it was this color. It wasn't blonde, it was red. It wasn't red, it was blonde. We don't know. We don't know. I know, for example, I recreated a historic IPA and we put so many hops in it that it broke the brewery. There was just kind of green juice coming out of between the seals and everything. And later I realized that the recipe that I was using, the hops they were putting in there probably had kind of 3-4% alpha acid.
Yeah.
And the hops that we were using 150 years later were kind of 14-15% alpha acid. So given that the ingredients change over time, I think it's impossible for us to ever say this was what IPA was like in 1920 or 1920 we can, but yeah, 1820 it'd be quite difficult to say.
Right. You kind of touched upon it very quickly. You mentioned the alcohol content of Green King being a 3 point whatever it was, and of course everybody thinks that IPA has to be 6%, and in fact historically it must have been high alcohol because again that would have helped helped it last the voyage. True or false?
Yeah, and I remember I got into a bit of a not an argument, but a disagreement with Ron Pattinson over this because he's the world's expert on looking at old brewing records and decoding them and telling us what the beer was actually like at that point. And a few years ago, Ron found some IPAs that were being shipped to India that were about 4.5%. And so that kind of blows a myth to a certain extent. But then Ron said, this proves that high strength IPAs were a myth. So no, it doesn't. It proves that low strength IPAs also went to India.
Right.
But so did high strength ones. So this I think my wife's just home. The dog's going crazy.
Oh.
I'm just going to close this door. Yeah. So I think with anything in beer, the black and white approach of this existed, therefore this didn't exist is usually wrong. I think the existence of B does not disprove the existence of A. It just proves the existence of B.
And A, yeah. Or possibly and A. Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So last question, what do you wish consumers understood and appreciated about IPA kind of as a whole?
Oh, that's a really good one.
How hazy they are, obviously.
Gosh. Yes. I'd like, yeah. I mean, I've got a bee in my bonnet about the traditional IPA because it was my favorite beer style, which is why I did the book. The last surviving example of that was the last surviving authentic example of that was Worthington White Shield, which ceased production last year. And I entered a piece I wrote about that to the North American Guild of Beer Writers. And the guy was complimentary about it who judged it, but said there's a bit of old man shouting at cloud to this piece.
Pete, can I tell you something? Can I tell you something?
Mm-hmm.
That was me.
Oh, thank you. But yeah, I do use it in my presentations that I do. I do use the adapted version of the Simpsons thing of old man shouting at cloudy beer. I am in that role. It's a role that I take on quite proudly. And I wish I didn't have to shout at cloudy beer. I wish there was more of an appreciation of the history and the fact that IPA does stand for India Pale Ale. There's a lot of people who drink it now who say it doesn't. In fact, the BJCP guidelines now say IPA does not stand for India Pale Ale.
What do they say it stands for?
It's a free-floating signifier.
A free-floating signifier.
And that might be what their words. That might be my words rather than theirs.
Oh, okay.
But the rationale is because these beers bear so little resemblance to the beers that went to India, they're still called IPAs, but we can't say that stands for India Pale Ale. Which is for me captures the whole everything we're talking about myths and arguments and evolution is captured in that one factoid. There is that India Pale Ale is no longer India Pale Ale.
Well, I guess lager is no longer lager because nobody actually
Of
puts it
course,
in,
that's a very good
caves
point.
and yeah. Okay,
Yeah, no
all
one's
words
What-
have
yeah.
no one
lost
likes
all
it.
meaning now.
Yes, 2024. Who knows? Well, this was a really good conversation, and I learned a lot, which is why we're here. Pete, if people
Pete
want
also
to,
learned a lot. Pete learned
and
that you were the one who gave him the negative
I really
comments.
liked that article. We all really liked that article. We liked both his articles. But yeah, no,
This is
and this
great.
isn't
Yeah.
about me. But we really appreciate
it was
you.
nice to get the feedback. It was really nice to get the
Yeah,
feedback.
no, it's yeah, both your pieces were really good. I really enjoyed both of them. But if people want to reach out to you and talk to you about IPA myths, do you have a website or are you on social
I
media?
do.
What's your what are your
I'm
handles?
on my website is petebrown.net. And then I'm Pete Brown Beer on all the socials. And the story of my epic voyage is available in the book Hops and Glory, which I think is still available in the United States.
Everyone, yep.
I'm gonna read that.
I'm also gonna read that. Pete, thank you so much for hanging out with us today and teaching us about IPA. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. It's lovely to talk about it, and it's a great conversation.
All right. Have a lovely day. Thank you so much. Cheers.
Cheers, Pete.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye.
So, Don, that was a great conversation.
That was a great conversation.
I learned what
like
did yeah, what did what did you learn? What did you learn? Tell me.
You know, I kind of make jokes about IPA, the term having lost all meaning.
I feel
Because
like
everybody
I feel like we just learned that it has.
But I mean, it sounds like it always kind of was variable, that, you know, lower alcohol or higher alcohol, and, you know, I don't
Blonde or red
Yeah.
or hazy or not.
And
I
yet
mean,
somehow we all kind of know what it means too, even though it is a fluid term.
it's true. Yeah, I really enjoyed the history aspect because it's nice to have someone sit down, like someone like Pete, and be like, give it to me straight, man. How did it happen? And Pete's like, here you go. And
Yeah.
I think a lot of people need to kind of I think this
And he shows us receipts. That's the point,
yes,
I think.
I think this podcast can be required listening for every old man in a tasting room. Please visit allaboutbeer.com and follow us on social media at allaboutbeer. And again, if you're feeling generous, please visit our Patreon page, patreon.com/allaboutbeer to support this show and others. Do you have questions for the experts? Email podcast@allaboutbeer. That's also the email for feedback, suggestions, and to inquire about supporting the show through advertising. Don, how can people reach out to you?
I am at the Dawn of Beer on X, Threads, and Instagram, and people can drop me an email at dawn@thedawnofbeer.com. How about yourself, Em?
I am at Pints and Panels at Instagram and Facebook. I have deleted Twitter. It is gone. Do not try to find me there. You will not find me there. And my website is www.pintsandpanels.com. If you enjoy this show, please share it with your friends, post about us on social media, and like and subscribe. Please help us spread the word of good beer. And here's a final word from our sponsor.
Looking to explore a new city with a vibrant beer scene? Put Rochester, New York at the top of your list. Located in the Finger Lakes region along Lake Ontario, Rochester is a top beer destination, home to over 24 breweries, including New York State's oldest, Genesee Brewing. Enjoy everything from hazy IPAs to crisp lagers, award-winning breweries, beer festivals, and tasting events all year long. There's always something fresh on tap in Rochester. Start planning your trip today at visitrochester.com.
We've participated at FOBAB since the very beginning of our brewery, which was 2012.
John Barley, Solomouth Brewing, 4-time FOBAB medalist.
This event gives brewers from across the world a chance to come here and compete with one-of-a-kind beers, some of the best offerings from breweries. These are beers that the brewers themselves are most excited about. If you're serious about beer, this is an event that you should not miss. For a full list of brewers and tickets, check out fobab.com, FOBAB.com. We'll see you at FOBAB November 22nd and 23rd in Chicago.
At Mega, the Estrella Galicia Museum, the tasting experience and the beer pairing are the highlight, offering an opportunity to explore a variety of beers from the Estrella Galicia portfolio. Mega is a must-visit for anyone interested in beer, history, or Galician culture. It's a place where you can not only learn about the science and craft of brewing, but also immerse yourself in the heritage of Estrella Galicia, Spain's most beloved beer brands. So, whether you're a beer aficionado or just curious about the process behind your favorite drink, if you're planning a trip to Spain, I recommend not missing the chance to visit Mega and discover the world of Estrella Galicia. It's a celebration of the art of brewing that's both informative and enjoyable. Learn more about it on Instagram at Mundo Estrella Galicia.
This show is produced by All About Beer. Visit allaboutbeer.com for articles, notes on this show and others, and to connect via the connect via the newsletter. There we go. And social media. Cheers.
Keep shouting at clouds.
Old man, I'm going to shout at clouds forever now.